All right, it looks like we have most people here. John will go ahead and keep letting people in as they show up, but I think we'll go ahead and get started. So today we are continuing with Module 3. My name is Emma Banks. I am the Secondary Digital Learning and Computer Science Specialist at the Department of Ed, and I'm going to let John introduce himself before we get moving.
Hello, my name is John Graham, and I'm the Elementary Digital Learning Specialist at the Department of Education. And we have an exciting topic, I think, to talk about today is voice and choice for students and how you can leverage that within your classroom. So this will be, I think, another fun topic for our last week of Remote Learning 101 as we're in Module 3, Part 2.
Might actually just start out there while I update.
All right, so today we are going to talk about leveraging student voice and choice. So a quick overview, we're gonna start with talking about student voice, and then we'll start moving into the integration of student choice. And then moving towards the end of things, we will talk about some tools and strategies for leveraging the two. So you might wonder why you would want to leverage student voice and choice, particularly in a remote learning environment. And one of the things that has been proven is that a combination of readiness and interest is what causes for an increase in engagement. And I think that we're kind of moving into that point with remote learning in the state where there are a lot more people who are ready. And so I think it's a little bit more about focusing on that interest piece to really reach that engagement level that we're all kind of striving for when we're hoping to connect with students. So we want to start out by framing this with the idea that you want to kind of prioritize voice over choice. So student voice would be, their preference in how, what they learn about and things of that nature, and giving them that platform where they feel like they're being heard. So emphasizing that it should take priority over giving them choices within a learning environment. So leading with student voice, there are a few things to keep in mind. I love the picture. That's the first time I'm seeing it, John. So you want to create norms and routines that make room for student voice. So how might you start your class off in a way that allows people to share how they're feeling or what they're thinking, or what might be more engaging for them, things of that nature. Try to build those into your norms and routines so that students, they're always feeling heard versus feeling like that's the rare occasion that they're actually getting their voice through. Look for opportunities to build in student voice when you're planning instruction. So when you're kind of putting together an assignment, a module, a lesson, look at it and see kind of where could I provide my students with the ability to share their voice and what they're thinking. And then bring in life beyond the classroom and ask for and encourage feedback. So provide students with that platform to provide you with feedback on what they think would be helpful and how to actually engage with their learning. And then leveraging student feedback in a way that makes students feel involved and heard. So don't just collect that feedback from students, but actually really show them that you're reading it and that you're doing something with it. So if you get feedback from students and they're like, okay, well, I really liked this topic, but I really did not enjoy this resource. This resource wasn't clear for me. So you might, the next time you kind of bring it up, you might bring that piece that you got some feedback that this resource wasn't a good fit for the lesson. And so you kind of are providing some additional resources that might be a better fit. And then that student, even anonymously, realizes that their voice has been heard and that you've adapted what you're doing to accommodate what they've mentioned. While this might not work in every instance, this is a really great way to try to leverage this idea of student voice. John, did you have something you wanted to add?
I think one of the things that's really important there is if you're asking, if you're putting the time or expecting students to put in the time to give you some sort of feedback, I think trying to honor that. And I understand that it can be really difficult if you're taking in that extra information, but I mean, this can work at a number of different levels. We're going to have a little activity that kind of gets at that in a second. But I think especially, going into the upcoming school year, I think one of the things to be thoughtful about, regardless of what the situation is, but if you're having students talk about themselves, kind of share information about themselves, try to find some mechanisms where you can bring that in. It's so crucial to building those relationships with students. And I know a lot of teachers will do something like having students write letters or filling out some sort of survey and something like that. And I think the challenge there is, how do you take in what you're getting from students and turning it into something meaningful? So, I mean, in some sense, you can kind of make that data that you can use to inform your decisions and try to cater to the interests of students and kind of get a sense of what what they would be more interested in doing for activities. I think the other part of that is you're able to build those relationships with students. If you're able to know, all right, this student has this hobby, this student likes this kind of music, this student has gone on a trip to this place, all those little things, they really, really add up quickly for students of all grade levels. So this isn't just something for little kids, but high school kids, it really makes a big difference to them as well.
Yeah, certainly. We're going to talk some more logistics about strategies as well, like John has mentioned. So if you're feeling overwhelmed with that concept, don't worry, we've got more.
Yeah.
Okay. So John is going to lead us through a little bit of an activity that's going to kind of model what student voice might look like in a remote environment.
So you're going to follow that link, bit.ly, and I can put it into the chat. So the link is case sensitive. So just make sure that you, let me see, why isn't that a live link? It doesn't like that either.
You have to do HTTPS : / Yeah.
There we go. There we go. So you can follow that link in the chat, or you can type it in right there, and then that should take you to a Google form. I'll give people just a second to pull that up, and then I'll take over on my screen. So this kind of gets at the idea of creating a learner profile. Part of that kind of beginning of the year intake or beginning of a semester or a class. I think this is certainly a worthwhile process to go through. I think this is the right one. There we go. So, actually I'll do the, so this is what you guys should be seeing on your end. So it's just a simple survey. So I've set it up so there are some multiple choice questions, some check boxes. So these ones you can pick multiples of. I think all of them are mandatory. So you can see it has the red star up there, shows if it's a mandatory question. So I don't need you to necessarily decide for yourself, but you can if you would like to. But I would ask that you guys take, just a minute to read through this and fill this out, and then we can kind of talk a little bit about this, about the data, and what you could do with it.
Still rusty with the music integration, or I could have had a great clip prepared for this moment.
So one of the things that I like about this is you can, and actually I kind of borrowed this model from a much larger and longer one. So you could do something that's very content specific. If you're working with younger kids, you actually could add in some more visual elements. If you wanted to, you could add in pictures and icons and things like that. It would make it a little bit easier, but I just wanted to show you. I mean, this is something, literally put this together in like 5 to 10 minutes, just a little survey like this using Google Forms. I think that's one of the kind of key points, is that this is something that you can put together really quickly. And as you use it, and I'm sure as you like read through it, you'd be like, oh, I should add this, I should add that. So certainly feel free to build upon this and recognize that there are things in it that you might want to tweak as time goes by. So one of the things that you might notice, well, first of all, I don't have a name piece in there. I would suggest including, student name, if you need to know like grade or any pertinent information that you would really need to have in there, you could have. But using checkboxes and multiple choice, like the bubble ones like these, those are really important because it's actually going to give me data. If I just left open-ended questions, if I just said, do you like to listen to music while you do schoolwork, and just had an open-ended question, if students write yes or no or sometimes or once in a while or whatever their variety of responses, your data on the back end, it's all going to be individual answers. So that's one of the reasons why, if you have options for them to select, even though it does sometimes seem kind of limiting, that is really beneficial in terms of giving you actually data that you can consume and work with. You can include this other option. So I have included that on some. So this is really crucial if you want to make sure that students are having their voice heard and they're not just feeling like I'm looking through a list of options. Maybe there's something in there you haven't taken account for. It's also good if you can see that you're getting a lot of responses, then you can actually go back to the form and adjust it. So you can do that pretty quickly. So you could do this with kids in period 1, give a quick look and be like, oh, I forgot to include this, and you could actually change it for your next period class, for example. So this is pretty short, and I kind of blended in a few different things. You could get into more personal pieces in here. The original one that I was looking at, they said, write something funny that happened to you recently, or name a book that you've read that you liked. So you can get into a lot of those parts if you want to, but one of the things you want to keep in mind is the more open-ended that your question is, then the less you can actually do with the responses. I mean, you'll have them all there that you can refer back to, but it can be a bit challenging. So I've got 22 responses to work with. So if you haven't used Google Forms before, this is the editor feature. So this is how I go through and actually set up and change the questions. Then at the top, I've got this response button that I can go to. So what I love about this is you can very quickly look at this and see, get that data instantly. So we can see, most people, it seems like they don't like listening to music when they're doing work. So that's a good thing to know. Maybe I might make the decision like, oh, when we have some downtime during class, if we're doing some work, maybe I'd play some music in the background. Maybe this data would, let me know, maybe I shouldn't be doing that. And then some of this information in terms of student placement around the room gives you some nice percentages. And this is a really good one. So half of the class really like to work by themselves. So if I'm doing some sort of project, I might give them the option of working by themselves, working with a partner, working in small groups. Or I might just kind of know that and say, you know what, that maybe we need to do some work around effective group work if we're going to do that, because maybe a lot of students work best by themselves because they've never been part of a successful group experience. And then this part. So this is a really good example. So people added in some pieces in there. Ooh, this one's good. All of the above. So that one I didn't set up as a, oh no, I think I changed it. I mean, you could have that so it could be a single choice. So it could be what is their absolute preference, but obviously some people picked multiple. So this is all really good data right there, and this is very digestible. So this is what I like about this. And I should show, there's this button up here that will pull this data into sheets, so you can see it that way. So that might be useful as well in terms of a sorting mechanism, because you can sort these. And then the other piece in the responses is you can go to the individual responses as well. So I could look through, and if you had students' names, you could actually find those different parts and pieces. So very user-friendly tool, really easy to set up. I think that automatic creation of data makes this really digestible. So hopefully people kind of get a sense of using that. So in terms of creating a learner profile, part of it is you can get that personal information back, which is really helpful. Part of it is you can kind of get students sort of metacognitive thinking about what are the ways that they think they best learn, or what are their learning preferences. And then you, as you get to know your students, you could really build more of a profile. As you see your students do work, as you see them, you know, the things that they struggle with, the things that they seem to enjoy, you could actually kind of build out your own profile. So I think that's certainly a consideration as well, where you can get that feedback from students, so you're having that voice. But then also, you know, any teacher does this. You're going to be kind of like watching your students and kind of figuring out what are their strengths and weaknesses. So actually building those learner profiles can help you. If you're going to give students choices, you'll have a better sense of giving them choices that they'd be successful in approaching.
Yeah, and I think that this is a really great example of using student voice to leverage the choice piece, which we're going to move into, because this is like you've collected their voice now. Like now you have each person's, you know, anything that you could have wanted to ask them, you've collected that. So now how can we take
All of it,
that
no.
and do it and use it to create choice?
Yep.
And so there was a question in the chat just about if we can share that link out for people to make a copy. And what we'll do is we'll add a separate link there so that you can see it as a user, but you could also have a separate link to make a copy to it.
Yeah.
So, okay, so I am going to go back. And now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk, thinking about this student voice, we're going to talk a little bit about the integration of student choice into what you're doing. So we want to let students choose as much as possible some of these bits and pieces. You can let students choose the what, where, when, how, who, why, all of those things. You really can allow them to have a certain degree of choice in each one of these components. And so we're going to talk about each one of these kind of briefly and talk about where and how you can integrate choice into these different components of the learning. And so starting with what, you can consider letting students have some choice in what they learn. So are there subtopics within an area that they could have choice within? Could students have some degree of choice in what they engage with to meet the outcomes and standards? So John mentioned that idea of gathering information using this survey. So one of the examples that we were looking at in our research for this was a history example. And one of the questions was, what's your favorite topic in history, or what are you most interested in about history? And so that question would allow the instructor to then provide choices within the history lesson, because they can look at that voice and be like, okay, so we have students interested in the Nile and interested in, I don't know, I'm not a history person, but just that idea that they could identify common themes and provide subtopics so that people could dig deeper. You know, if you're studying Egypt, then you could have multiple facets within that students could pick from. And
it's
then,
also a good way. It's also a good way to really find those, you know, niche interests that kids can have. And, you know, maybe when they were little, they were really into, you know, Egypt and might have some, you know, vast wells of knowledge. Obviously with like really young kids, they're very upfront about this knowledge that they like. But sometimes with older kids, it takes a little pulling to get that information out of them.
yes, definitely. And I think that with older students as well, I think the third piece of this is a little bit easier to kind of talk about outcomes that they're trying to meet and let them have some degree of say in that what piece of how they're going to reach those. And that kind of touches into the how part, which we'll get into in a minute. Okay, so talking about where, you can allow students to have some choice in where they learn. I'm sure that this is not a new concept to some people. I've heard of a lot of different ways that this can be done, but discussing the learning space with your student, like what creates a good learning space, what is conducive to learning, those kinds of things can help to set the ground work before you allow them to just choose where they're going to learn. I think in remote learning, this is one of those things that can become a fun piece of it. I think we get really focused on the idea that we're just going to be sitting here staring at a screen. But if you have wireless internet and a good connection, then you could potentially move all over the place, or you could connect at a library, or you could go outside, or there's all sorts of ways that students can connect with their learning in a remote environment. So providing ways to encourage that constructively, I think that's where the second piece there comes in, like having that discussion and setting the groundwork of what a conducive learning environment is, and then being like, okay, so let's explore how we might reconfigure where we're learning, whether it's remotely or in the classroom. You can kind of have those conversations. I think in the classroom is probably more familiar to people, reconfiguring desks and spaces, making comfortable seating, those kinds of things. In a remote environment, you obviously have a whole lot less control over the where piece. So I think it becomes about providing students with that ability to have agency on their own to decide that. So providing that groundwork, and then the framing for like, what are some alternative spaces that might be conducive to learning, and providing them with those, basically not making that assumption that they've already thought of that. I think that that's one thing that can happen is, well, if they wanted to, they can learn wherever they want now, so they'll just be wherever they want. But they may not have thought about that they might have a better learning experience if they, move to a different part of the house or go to the library or things of that nature. So just considering how you can provide them some choice in the where. Moving on to how, I think this is one that's probably really familiar to people, the idea of integrating options for different learning modalities and providing choice for them in how they're going to learn, asking them how they're going to demonstrate their learning, and ask them how they would like to learn can help you to discover new and creative ways to engage with your learners. Sometimes, which of course there have to be constraints, because of course you still need to meet outcomes, but if you provide them with some brainstorming room to come up with ideas of how they might engage with their learning, then they might come up with something that you haven't even thought of. All of these pieces help to aid that intrinsic piece that becomes so important in remote learning. They have to be interested in the how, in the where, in the what. They really have to be invested in all of these pieces in order for that intrinsic motivation to really stick around, which is the golden nugget for student engagement online. So moving into why, you can absolutely allow students to have some choice in why they are learning what they learn. One of the best ways to do that would be to involve students in the why process. Ask them why they need to learn something, how it might be useful, or why they want to learn something. Something that they want to learn might transcend into something that they need to learn. So exploring the wants can also help to lead students to those needs of why they need to learn something. Providing them with some prompting statements when you're in this phase of kind of going through things can be super helpful. So I will learn this in order to blank, having that action, an actionable step for them can really help in the understanding of the why piece, instead of us just trying to have that marketing elevator pitch of, you want to know this because, try to ask them, like, why would you need to know this? Why might you want to know this? And really involve them in that process of discovery. Moving into when, I think this is another piece that plays really heavily into remote learning. And additionally, research suggests that when people actually have the choice of remote learning versus it being kind of forced upon them, that this is one of the primary reasons that they state that they want to engage in remote or distance learning, is for the flexibility that can come along with the when piece. So allowing them to have choice in, possible timelines and deadlines, co-constructing those with students can be super effective. Obviously you need the final oversight, but kind of providing them with a timeline and then having that discussion of, okay, what would some potential deadlines be that are reasonable for you? What might you need to accomplish before reaching this deadline? How much time will you need to do that? Those kinds of things can be really good brainstorming tools for helping students to consider how long something's going to take them and what a reasonable deadline would be, which of course will just aid them throughout the rest of their lives, no matter what age they're at, because that's something that just becomes more and more prevalent, is being able to give a realistic timeline and goals for something that you're trying to achieve. So definitely try to engage them in the process of creating those deadlines and due dates, and have them, whenever possible, set their own, because then they are being held responsible to themselves, and it will help them to kind of understand whether or not the goals that they set were realistic. Building in that piece of reflection as well can be really helpful. So you didn't meet this timeline on this, so what might we need to do next time to make sure that the timeline that you set up is more realistic for what you need? Or what prevented you from meeting this timeline? Or if you got it done early, you know, kind of exploring those different things, like what was easier that you didn't anticipate, and really kind of engaging them in that metacognitive process of how they learned and what they learned, and all of that can help with the when piece. Who, I know that this is one that can receive some mixed feelings, and that's allowing students to have a choice in who they learn with and from. And so I am already predicting, you know, you have a classroom of people and you tell them to split up into groups, and they're all going to pick their favorite people immediately. Like, oh, I'm partners with Susie because she's my best friend. And so how can we build in reflection that will allow students to think more about more than just relationships and friendships when they're choosing their group partners, but who can help me with this task, or who could I be the most help to in a group project? And kind of those types of reflections that will help them to be intentional in the choices that they're making about who they're working with. So potentially using roles and things like that can help with that piece. Depending on the age of your learners, they may not be comfortable with answering some of those questions. They may not know who could help them. So anytime you can provide different strategies for them to use in that selection process, and always building in that piece of reflection so that they can kind of understand how things went and what they could have done differently. What, you know, if I picked Susie and my project didn't go well, you know, why? Was Susie maybe not the best fit because she was interested in something else than what I was interested in? So our styles didn't line up, or our thoughts and ideas didn't line up. You know, those types of reflection can be really helpful the next time that students go to pick, you know, who they're going to work with. That kind of thing is very much a process. I think you'll find probably the first time everybody's going to choose their friend. And so having that reflection piece can be really crucial, because the next time they might think differently if we build in some of those pieces. And then the last piece of the who would be encouraging students to consider the audience that they are creating for. So this is kind of that idea of when you're doing some projects and things of that nature, that is part of the who, allowing them to choose who their audience will be and design their project or their experience to that audience, allows them to also have some choice in the who piece of their learning. So we are now going to move into some strategies and tools for leveraging student voice and choice. And I'm going to hand it off to John to talk about the next few items.
All right, so this is when Emma and I were first talking about voice and choice, we were trying to think of some good models out there that I know people are using in different places, and I've heard kind of good things about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Genius Hour. This is sometimes called 20% time projects. Sometimes it's called passion projects. It has a few different names. I think Genius Hour is kind of the one that's taken for one reason or another. So just a little backstory on Genius Hour. So this was inspired by Google's 20% project. So the concept is that employees at Google were able to spend 20% of their work time on kind of personally, projects that they were personally invested in that they thought would be helpful to kind of Google as a company. And kind of the story there is that Gmail, AdSense, and some other tools and features kind of grew out of people using this 20% time to kind of develop different products and features. A lot of people have kind of like held this up as like a fantastic innovation model. There has been a certain level of kind of skepticism if this really existed in Google as much as it kind of was said, or kind of what the lore is. But regardless of whether, you know, whether that's true or not, kind of the idea itself has definitely taken hold, and people have kind of run with it and moved it into the educational realm. So AJ Giuliani brought that over to the educational realm in a big way, and he's kind of tied it in with a lot of his educational works, books, courses, stuff like that that he's offered. And it's been kind of tied in with project-based learning, inquiry-driven education, design thinking, interest-based learning. So a lot of those kind of broad terms that edu-speak that you sometimes will hear people refer to, Genius Hour kind of ties in with a lot of those, in that it's students creating a project with their own, you know, their own interests in mind. Sometimes it's kind of answering a question, but it's always about, you know, moving forward and learning and kind of creating something. Whatever that something is can vary widely. So some considerations if you're interested in doing Genius Hour projects. One of the big things right up front is you've got to have some check-ins with your students kind of laid out. You need to have a process set up so you can be moving things forward. If students feel like they don't know what they're supposed to be doing, they will get frustrated and they will disengage. So it's important to keep that engagement by having those check-ins just to see how they're doing, what help they need, you know, helping them move forward. Sometimes, I mean, if you do weekly check-ins or whatever, I mean, sometimes they're going to have bigger gains than others. Sometimes, you know, they're going to have a lot more like physical, tangible stuff to show you. Sometimes they're just ideas need to marinate and need some time. The second one, let it go. You really have to let students struggle through this process to some extent. I know as teachers, people often are, you know, quick to jump and help students. And some students definitely will need different levels of support, because they can disengage really quickly if they feel frustrated or confused. So that part makes sense, but allowing them to kind of work through a process, work through a project, that is definitely going to come with some challenges, and you have to kind of let them work through some of those struggles. And a lot of it is, you know, picking the right time to jump in. So if they're working with a team, teams are going to have some struggles. You know, somebody's going to be doing the bulk of the work, or somebody's not going to be pulling their share, or maybe just communication. They don't have a structure in mind. So there are ways that you can, kind of, as Emma was mentioning earlier, that students will want to work together. There will be some challenges if kids, you know, go right and work with their friends. And sometimes you just have to let some of those challenges work through a little bit, so you can say, all right, guys, you know, I know you're friends. I know you want to work together. We've got to figure out how to make this work. Recognizing that, you know, students will hopefully want to stay friends after their project. Mentorship, I think, is really important if you are facilitating this. So this is kind of, as opposed to traditional teaching, standing in front of a classroom, doing whatever, a lot of this model is about facilitating this experience. So checking in with students, checking in with groups, trying to figure out what it is that they need. So part of that can be directing them towards resources, but another part might be directing them towards experts and specialists. So the nature of the internet is finding those people and making those connections. And I've been shocked over the years that level of connections that students have been able to make with things like National History Day, where they've been able to connect with like leading scholars in a specific area. It's really amazing. And I think if students reach out to those people, you definitely would get a response more often than not, and sometimes, you know, maybe way more than you might have anticipated. Kind of going off the first one about having check-ins, so having those progress monitors, you also want to have an endpoint, so something that they're working towards. And that I've found in doing these kinds of projects, often my GT students were the ones that really struggled with having a project where they're kind of doing that work where there's a lot of choice involved, because they're often very intelligent, they have a lot of ideas, or they're really, you know, really successful at the traditional school model. So they're kind of trying to figure out, what is that endpoint? You know, where do you want me to go? So if you're kind of hands off and it's like, no, like you've got to kind of take some ownership of where you're going, that can be difficult. So I've found sometimes with those students, you really got to figure out what is that tangible thing that you're trying to work towards. And sometimes that's very clear and they're like, okay, I get it. And they can, you know, move forward and do some really exceptional work once they have a sense of what it is that they're working towards. Other students, you know, they'll kind of work and they'll figure out that endpoint as they, you know, as they kind of go through the initial phases of the process. Reflection. This is so important. And I think, again, getting back to student voice, I think having those moments where, you know, maybe just as a class group, you've got to say, you know, some of you are really struggling with this. I think, you know, you need some additional support, or maybe we need to kind of talk about how things are going, how people are going about things, because I had not anticipated this problem. I think you can be very honest with students about that, because while students like the, you know, often like the freedom of it, I think if things aren't working well, they're not necessarily always able to see that, oh, you know, we've been spending too much time on, you know, this part of the problem, and maybe it's not as big of a, you know, big in terms of the overall scheme of things. That's something I've seen with students who've done like video projects a lot. Sometimes they get so caught up in kind of like minute editing details, or trying to find or like fix a certain clip, or something doesn't seem quite right. And it's like, at some point it's like, guys, you've got to maybe move on and kind of reevaluate that little piece there, because it's not working right now. So I think those reflection pieces, you need to kind of like have those baked into the process, and you can do those whole group if you have a class that's working through Genius Hour, and you can also work through that individually with different groups. And then I think the last part is celebrating the journey, because ultimately what you want students to be doing is to be engaged in learning and really growing through this process. And I think at the end, and that might be, you know, a special night where students have projects out, if they've made projects and parents can come in, those types of things are awesome. If students have put together some sort of presentation, you know, give them a forum that's appropriate for them to present, whether it's presenting to younger students in your building, whether it's presenting to peers, whether it's presenting to, you know, like I was saying, like if you had a parent night or something like that. So I think that's really important, because students, if they go through this process, they are going to grow and they are going to learn. And I think that's really the thing that you want to celebrate, that they've made that piece going through, you know, going through the process, they've really learned and grown. And I think celebrating that's really important. Whereas a lot of times it's, you know, you're trying to get to that end point to get that project done, and then it's done, and then you move on to the next thing. And I think it's good to have that reflection piece, but also to really look back and like, look at all this amazing work that you did, and kind of talk through all the growth that they made. And I think that's important, because project-based learning, it is a challenge, and students are going to have those challenges throughout the process. And if you can have a student go through a project successfully, then that is something really that will stick with them, and you can always refer back to that. Or, you know, if they move on from you to another teacher, then that teacher can maybe refer back to that if that was something, you know, they shared with the school or whatever. So just something to be kind of thinking about if you're considering the Genius Hour projects, or really kind of any project-based learning overall. So I do have some resources in here if you're interested in Genius Hour. So some articles in here to kind of give you an overview. I try to boil down some of these into those considerations in the last one, but some of these will speak to more kind of grade specific or very specific challenges, or integrating it with different groups of students. And I did include a nice video in there from I'm spacing on his name right now, but a guy that had worked with AJ Giuliani. And I think it's a really great video if you're trying to like get students up and motivated for getting things started. Because I think one of the big challenges for Genius Hour is it's often kind of a blank slate. And for some students, that is overwhelming to have just kind of this blank openness, like I can do anything, where some students, they like that and they really rise to that occasion. They like having the opportunity to do something new or try something new or follow a passion. For other students, that is like overwhelming. There's kind of a mind stagnation. So that's another consideration we're making as well, is that you have, maybe if you have exemplars or have some of these videos actually, or these websites will have some examples in there. So if you can find examples to show students, sometimes that will kind of get the gears turning in terms of what a project is that they might want to do. So I think that is kind of the basics for Genius Hour. And certainly that's something, if you have used that before, then I'd love to kind of hear about it. And if it's something that you're kind of more have some curiosity about and try it for next year, I'd love to hear about it as well.
Awesome. So just some general strategies for voice and choice. And some of these we've kind of referred to, talked about, but some of them we haven't yet. So I'll just kind of briefly go over these. Learner profile cards, that is kind of the basic idea of that form at the beginning. That would be to develop your learner profiles for your students. There are a ton of different ways that you can do that. There's some resources at the end of this presentation that talk a little bit more in depth about that, but forms is a really great way to do that in a remote environment for sure. And then student surveys and student feedback, surveying them to find out what their interests are, and then asking them for feedback on things both during construction and the reflection piece. So if you're building an assignment for students, encourage them to provide feedback on it before you have determined that you're going to deliver it to them, and see if there's anything that they would change that would make it more engaging. And then in the choice learning menus and choice boards, we've definitely talked, I think we've talked about all three of those, at least all three of these, at least anecdotally, in the Remote Learning 101 series. Learning menus and choice boards are kind of the grid-like type of setup where you can have students choose from activities that line up with certain competencies or actions or goals, however you have it set up. Stations and centers are that idea of having a rotating model where the activities don't move, but the students move throughout the activities. And so they're kind of getting that change up throughout the day or throughout the class, however you have it set up. And then the tic-tac-toe would be having just you could do it with bingo too. You could have a I should have put that in there. You could have a bingo board or a tic-tac-toe board where students can kind of play the game, and as they do, they have to go through and complete the different tasks that are on the tic-tac-toe board or on the bingo board as you progress through it. So those are some really kind of engaging ways that you can leverage these. There's all sorts of other ways that I'm sure that you're probably already using to do this, but these are just some of the most common strategies that we've seen. So we wanted to include some of them. Okay, so this slide has entirely too much text on it. I'm going to preface with that. I could not find a good way to separate this without making it just too much in any way. So I just decided that I would put this quick list and we would just have one slide that has too much text on it. And I'll be okay with it. So this is a 10-step process for leveraging voice and choice within everyday classroom topics or activities. So this is a process that you can scaffold at a macro or micro. You can go as small with it as what you need to. But this kind of, if you're just like, oh my gosh, where do I start? There's so many pieces. This would actually provide you with an A to Z kind of walkthrough of what this process could look like with an activity. And so you want to start with introducing topic and standards, then determine what students already know about that topic, and then provide them with a preview of it. So, that's where the elevator pitch, so to say, would come in. Try to find something that will hook their interest, whether it's a personal story or a video or an anecdote from social media that they would identify with, providing them with that little tidbit of this is why this might be interesting to you. Then that piece about sharing with students how you might normally teach it, and then asking them for feedback on what might make it more engaging for them, or what they might appreciate that would be different, that you could adapt it for your specific class or your specific group. And then move into the brainstorming process of brainstorming questions that they'll need to answer to achieve the goals, and providing scaffolding that for them so that they're focusing on how and why questions and not getting too lost in the question world. Because of course you'd say develop questions on this topic and it could go really far. So providing them with some scaffolding can really help with that piece of things. Then having students work in groups when possible. If you're working asynchronously, this might be more challenging to have them do as a group. So you might just have them collaborate in one document or something so that it feels more like a group. But have them pick a question and then brainstorm oh brainstorm and explore the topics and the questions, and then consider organizing your groups of students, if you have the ability to have groups, by their interest in the topics. So if you have a group who, we're talking about Egypt, and you have a group that is interested in the Nile, which is apparently the example I'm just going to keep using, you might group the students who are interested in the Nile, and then group the students who are interested in the mummies, and keep it so that their interests align with each other so that they can collaborate in that way. That can also help with that whole idea of allowing them to choose who they work with, because once they've picked an interest, then that choice can kind of happen naturally, and you can help to mitigate some of those, oh, I want to work with Susie. So that's a form of scaffolding that you can build in. And then this piece of asking students how they're going to answer the question and demonstrate their understanding. This is the piece that might need some extra support depending on your learners' comfort levels with these types of things. But this is a really great exercise to get them thinking about what learning looks like for this topic. What does it mean to have mastered this, to master an understanding of this? Then you can have students write a proposal that describes how they're going to show what they know, how they're going to collect their resources, what resources they intend to collect, how they're going to measure their success, and how they're going to evaluate the productivity of their group or themselves if they're not in a group. So have them write up a proposal. It could be quick, it could be a paragraph easily, depending on what age and group and topic you're talking about. But have them write up a proposal that basically is a pitch to you about why they should be able to learn this way about this thing. And then have students share their proposals with others if possible. You can I'm not trying that. You can make them anonymous.
Anonymize.
Thank you. Oh my gosh, I was like anonymize, it was getting out of control. Yeah, you can make them anonymous so that students don't know who they're providing feedback on, but that process can really help to identify common interests, themes, things of that nature. Having them look at each other's proposals can be really effective with creating alignment and things of that nature. And then this final piece is just making sure that your students have access to the resources that they've identified, and making sure to give them plenty of time to work through whatever the topic or assignment is. And so by setting them up with all of these pieces and having them collaborate on what this learning experience is going to look like, feel like, sound like, all those pieces of the who, what, when, where, why type of thing. Once you've included all of that, that last piece of setting students off and having them go to work, that intrinsic motivation is going to be there because they've created this learning experience with you. So they're invested in it in a sense. So they'll be more likely to want to actually follow it through to completion because they realize that, oh, well, I said that I understand this topic when I do this or when I reach this. So I need to make sure that I get there. It becomes much more intrinsically motivated than just to please the teacher or just to complete the assignment. Which is just so crucial when a student is in an isolated remote learning environment. So again, I apologize for all the text, but hopefully that's helpful. The resource for that is right here in 10 Steps to Voice and Choice. That's really great. They go a little, Barbara Bray is her name. She goes more in depth about those 10 steps and kind of walks through them. I found that really empowering because I think that it can be really easy to get overwhelmed with this process and then feel like you're also losing control. And of course, control may not be the best word, but you're losing reins of your class. If you provide them with too many choices, too much voice, then you can kind of feel like they're drowning out the teacher voice, which is also super important in this environment. So I think that having something like these 10 steps can be really helpful in trying to scaffold that and prevent it from getting too big. And then the top resource is just kind of covering some of those what, where, when, and why of student choice. And then a great article that talks about the ability to empower your students using choice and voice and how empowerment increases engagement and it creates a more effective learning experience. So that article is really great. And then we have the learner profiles, the personalization of the learning preference cards. That is a resource that explores that in a little bit more depth. John, I don't know if you wanted to mention something about that resource in specific.
I just think that what I like about that one is I think it kind of gets at the process. So part of it, I think, is getting your voice from your students. I think part of it is also your teacher experience and your observations and kind of melding those together into building a learner profile. And I think that's kind of you can't have all or the other. You want to have some of both.
So moving into our checklist, you want to lead with student voice, but also integrate student choice. So kind of use that voice to leverage the choice piece so that you're making informed decisions about how you're going to leverage that choice. I think it can be really easy to not want to include too much choice. So trying to use that voice to do it where it makes sense, where it's purposeful and meaningful, can be really a great way to approach that. Consider using some of the elements, if not all of the elements of Genius Hour. That's a really fantastic model. There's a lot of research behind it. So also, I think students just really love that idea of like, I'm going to work on whatever I want right now. Like, it's just very empowering for them to have that freedom. I don't think that that's something that is very mainstream. I think it's becoming more mainstream, but anytime that you can kind of consider those elements will increase your engagement for sure. Using strategies to engage voice and choice. We've talked about some of those, like the learner profile cards, using some of those, like the tic-tac-toe boards, stuff like that. And then leveraging voice to guide classroom activities. Really use that voice that they've given you. If you've asked for that information, try even in the smallest ways. I think John mentioned a few at the beginning, kind of that idea that if you have a student who's been to a certain place, like maybe they went on a summer vacation to, probably not this year, but maybe they did, to an interesting place that ties into the course content. So could you potentially bring that up and kind of let them know that, like, yeah, I read your survey and I know that you went to Guatemala or wherever, and we're going to kind of work that into this. And I think that you could potentially even ask that student to contribute about their situation or their experience. But my word of caution about that would just be to make sure that you ask the student before just calling on them on the spot. But if you want to bring in that conversation, I think that that's a really great way to bring in that voice as well. And then creating a process for gathering and responding to student feedback. I think we've really alluded to that heavily in this session, but that is, I think, the gold for this session is that idea that if you're going to collect this feedback, the survey, the information about your students, really try to be purposeful in the use of it. You know, if they say that they prefer to learn with no music, then maybe you don't play music, or you allow people to listen to music in headphones, you know, and you could even verbally say that, you know, like we did a survey and we know that, you know, the majority of you, 72% of you don't enjoy listening to music. So if for, you know, the 20, well, I don't even remember what I said now, but the other percent of you, like, you can listen to music in your headphones, but we're not going to listen to music as a class because that's not what the majority prefers. So just kind of using those to integrate it into what you're doing, and actually having a process for that can really help. It can get overwhelming with how much information you can gather from students, particularly if you are, you know, a high school student who, I mean, a high school teacher who sees, you know, 150 kids or more in any given day. It can be really hard to do this in as personalized a way as what it would be if you had the same group of 25 kids for the entire year. So thinking about that when you're going to build these things and having your process align with the amount of students that you're going to encounter. So I think that's when some of those things that John mentioned about the form become really helpful, because then you can make generalizations based just on their responses. So you can pull up those charts, the graphs and things, and look at it and be like, okay, so the majority of us feel this way. And so then you're still representing the voice of your students, you know, but it's at 350 students. You're going to want to generalize versus trying to be quite as personalized as what you might be if you're going to call out a student for something that they responded to because you're together all day. Like, the relationship building piece is a little bit different. So just considering that can be really helpful in establishing your process for this piece. Okay, so we are at the questions phase and we only have a few minutes left. So I'm gonna just blow past this slide and show you the link to the certificate, but I would also love to just open things up, and John will toss that link into the chat.
I already did it.
Okay, perfect. But I'd love to just open things up for any questions that anyone might have, or thoughts they want to share, anything like that.
Yeah, I had a question maybe you could help me with. I was really intrigued by this whole Genius Hour model, and considering that it's kind of adapted from a workplace model, I'm curious, and maybe when I look into this, this will become evident, but what's kind of the standards for assessment around this? I'm curious. I'm going to spend 20% of the time of students. I'd love to connect that to some sort of standard assessment, and is that in the philosophy of the model, I guess?
I mean, I think it depends because it's such a broad model. I think to some extent, I mean, I've seen primarily in Maine, the teachers that I've seen and heard about using this have primarily used it with GT students. So their time's kind of structured a little bit differently, and the areas that they focus on work a little differently. So I think that's kind of one consideration. I think the other piece is you can have a focus to it. So if you give them, you know, a certain level of parameters, I think that certainly makes sense. So don't feel like it has to be completely wide open, because there's only so much you can do, and you can just say to your kids, you know, we have, you know, certain expectations of what we need to do with our time. And I almost think of like science fair projects or something like that, where it's very open in a lot of ways, but there's kind of this idea of science being kind of the focus, if that kind of helps. I mean, you can, and I'm sure as you look through some of the materials that we shared, you'll be able to find some ways to tie it to different standards or learning targets a little bit more purposefully.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, I actually run a class that's on the other end of the spectrum. I have a special ed class that's a seminar class, but we do have like goal setting standards. So the idea of having an open-ended, like, I don't have to be content specific in that class, but just the idea of them having goals that they're motivated by themselves, especially with that 10-step scaffolding process, might be something I'm thinking about doing.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, special education, alt ed, I think there's a lot of potential there for that model. And at the very least, just to kind of try it out in, I mean, even in kind of a small way, if you, you know, dedicated, depending on what your schedule is, I mean, if you dedicated, certain number of days over the course of a semester or something. I think that could be helpful. But for some students, it's going to be a learning process because we don't often ask kids to do this type of work. So they have to get kind of comfortable with it. So if they're students that you work with regularly, you might have the benefit of, being able to work them through that process. I don't know if they're like special ed students that you have contact with from year to year, but I know, like I was saying with GT students, often they have kind of a cohort of students again and again over a couple of years. So they're able to work through a process like that.
Yeah, I've got like a 2-year class rotation. So yeah, I see the kids for multiple years, and it is something that where we can spend the time to work on the different steps to really just like I said, like I was saying, like to establish goals. And the idea of having your own projects might be a good way to do that, because currently a lot of their goals are around transition planning. What are you going to do when you get out of high school and all that kind of stuff? And they're just not really ready for that a lot of times. So it's like pulling teeth. And if I can like leverage, like I said, their engagement, maybe that might help.
And I think working through a project is so important for kids to kind of have, those short-term, long-term, medium-term goals, kind of working through all of that, because you make so much progress. And when you're at the end point and you look back, it's really amazing to kind of see and sometimes it's you have that final product that you're going to hold up and it's like, look at all the work that you put into this. And sometimes it's like, think about all the stuff that you learned about that you were able to, invest in what you've created. So I think and those really, and the research shows, those are the experiences that really stick with kids in a big way. So it is a big time investment, and it's definitely challenging for teachers, but I think the payoffs on the other end really are so apparent when you see it, at the end point.
Thank you. Great content today.
Yeah.
I could add a comment regarding the Genius Hour. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that is done all the time. There's projects that we have done in the past that apply very nicely to the process of the Genius Hour. For example, I have an AP class, AP BC Calculus that I teach. And towards the end, after they have done the AP, I create a project that is an innovation project in which they actually have the freedom to work on a particular model that they have to improve. And for that, we're using GeoGebra, and it's quite interesting what they can come up with it. And the idea is innovation, and that is the standard that I'm holding them to, but it's very open-ended. And also they are in control of the time, and they are in control of the final product.
Yeah, and that's definitely gets at kind of the issue sometimes. What do you do with AP students after the exam? So I think that's a fantastic model that you shift it to something that students are really invested in working on. That's a great idea. Well, we are at almost 5 minutes over, so we probably